Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video, continuing with our theme of talking about Napoleon this week with the release of the Ridley Scott movie, which I will have seen by the time you see this video. I'm watching it on release day. So we're taking a look at some alternate history today. This is Alternate History Hub with a little help, it appears, from the armchair historian. This is What If Napoleon Never Fell? So as always, I'll put the link down in the description to the original content so you can check it out without my commentary. This is an interesting what if because it certainly could have happened. There were moments, especially toward the end of Napoleon's reign, where he could have accepted peace that would have allowed him to keep the throne of France as an emperor. But he chose not to do that and lost everything because of it. So let's see what they have to say. Let's dive in.
Napoleon and Waterloo. Name a more iconic duo. Well, okay, we get the gag.
Oh, brutal. They show the Germany-Brazil score from the World Cup a few years ago. Man, ouch.
It's over with.
Interesting music.
One of the great questions of history is, what if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? It's an interesting concept. Napoleon lost.
See, here's the thing. Of all the things, the places I would go for a diverging point in history, and that's what we talk about when we deal with alternate history, right, is where did the change happen that results in a different outcome? Waterloo's not it. I mean, at that point, Napoleon's done. There's no scenario that I can see in which Napoleon hangs on at that point in 1815. If we're going to talk about Napoleon hanging on to his throne and Napoleon continuing as French emperor, I think at latest we have to go back to when he rejects the deal, I think in 1813, that would have allowed France to basically hang on to its borders and Napoleon to hang on to his throne and kind of give up most of their other conquests. I think by the time you get to his first abdication in 1814, there's no scenario for me in which Napoleon continues.
So, what if not that happened? While it's an interesting question, it's one that ignores the broader scope. Napoleon's fall was not simply because he lost at Waterloo, it was because he lost the core fighting force of his army, the control over his defeated enemies, an invasion in Russia, and maybe, just maybe, after years of fighting, something within himself. What I'm saying is Napoleon's downfall was much more than just Waterloo.
Thank you.
I still want to talk about that. If you don't know really anything about Waterloo itself, check out this video done in collaboration with Griffin from the Armchair Historian.
And I've said this before and I'll say it again. Waterloo, if Napoleon wins at Waterloo, and he very well could have, let's say the Prussians get held up, and it's just Napoleon versus Wellington. For all you Wellington simps out there, Napoleon would have beaten Wellington without the help of the Prussians, okay? Even odds, Napoleon takes Waterloo. You get the Prussians showing up, that turns the tide. So let's say that happens. Well, Napoleon just loses another Waterloo a few weeks later or a few months later. It doesn't change anything.
That way you aren't confused. Alright, you good? Great. Even if Napoleon did win at Waterloo, say he was more bold in his actions, sent the old guard in earlier, his flanks defended against the Prussians, go through any small tactical change, just as Napoleon did in his head for the rest of his life on an Atlantic rock, the state of Europe was simply everyone against France. Yep. Even if Waterloo is won, there will need to be another battle to secure that victory, and another, and another. And while
100%.
a younger Napoleon maybe could have done that, times had changed. He was older. The gas was getting low. The water
wasn't that old, though. He was my age, and I don't feel that old. I'm 46. That's about how old Napoleon was when all this went down, right? He's not that old. It's not that. It's just like he said, the army's not there. After Russia, after 1812, any semblance of a powerful fighting force for Napoleon's gone.
The Waterloo campaign was an offensive endeavor, France invading to fight back the British and Prussians. It was a game that Napoleon wanted to play, but simply wasn't prepared for. And the only way to win this game was not to play.
That's right.
Napoleon might might have held on to power longer than 100 days after his return if he fought instead a defensive war. Yes, it might have been unpopular to allow the enemy onto French lands, but this time would be spent recruiting more men to defend France, or that's at least how he would phrase it. Napoleon would fight on his own land and force the Allies to come to him, a war of survival for the French Revolution itself, or at least to the French how it would be seen. Keep in mind, during all of this, the French people supported Napoleon. The only reason
they did, but I would say this, if Napoleon comes in, takes over, gets everybody behind him, and then immediately starts fighting a defensive war in which he's probably getting beat and he just kind of is trying to hang on. To me, that comes across to the French people like this is all about Napoleon and hanging on to his throne, not the glory of France, not about winning victory over your enemies. And I just don't know if he would have the support that he might have otherwise have. So for me, I understand that this is the whole basis for this is about Napoleon coming back after his first exile. I still think for me, if I'm going to do an alternate history where Napoleon hangs onto his throne, I go back to 1813, not 1815.
He was able to reclaim his throne with a simple lift of his hat was because the people were sick of the Bourbon dynasty. The Allies were seen as foreign powers wishing to reinstall a monarch, which they were. And
that's the thing people keep forgetting about Napoleon. They keep talking about Napoleon like he was this raving dictator hell-bent on conquering all of Europe. Understand that most of the wars Napoleon fought were wars that were started and continued by other people. The British primarily, but other nations, Austria, Russia, are kind of the main antagonists in all this. Napoleon tried repeatedly early on to try and make peace, but the British didn't want peace because the British wanted to restore the Bourbons to the throne of France. They wanted Napoleon out of there, first as consul and then later as emperor. So if it had been left up to Napoleon, most of these Napoleonic wars would never have happened in the first place.
War inside France, ironically, might be like a war in Spain when Napoleon himself invaded. This is just me theorizing, but perhaps the French learned a thing or two from the Spanish guerrillas, but also had that military experience to back it up. If Napoleon was to survive, it wouldn't be just from his own military, but the people rallying to support him in defense of their home, which might make a long-scale war against France for the coalition far more tedious than they wished. But for now, it's hard to say if Napoleon would have won, because he didn't do this. He instead...
Yeah, and I agree with him that the only scenario in 1815 that has any chance of success for Napoleon would be this kind of a war.
Took the fight to the coalition and lost. So even with winning Waterloo, or defending France, Napoleon still is just barely holding on to power.
Yeah.
There had to be some different change. Something so catastrophic to Napoleon that might have been prevented. I wonder what that was.
There you go. This makes a lot more sense to me.
Russia was the death blow to Napoleon. Not the Russian military, just Russia itself. The weather, the geography, the people's ability to not play by European rules of surrender.
Yep.
This set fire, get it, to Napoleon's European plans. But why did France choose to invade Russia in the first place?
By 1812,
it's all about the UK.
Napoleon had beaten virtually every nation on mainland Europe into submission or joined it in alliance. But his mastery over the continent was not absolute. All it would take was one humiliating defeat to shatter the illusion. While France was the undisputed major power on the land, the French would, despite all their efforts, never be able to compete with the British at sea. The Royal Navy remained defiant, curbing France's navy from attempting an invasion on the British Isles.
But my daughter would say we have that to thank for the wonder that is Nutella. And if you go to France, man, Nutella is everywhere. Nutella is made from hazelnuts, which they have hazelnut trees in abundance in France. And because they couldn't get chocolate because of all the trading and things like that, the blockade by the British, thank you for Nutella.
Thus, Napoleon decided he would wage a war of attrition. His plan was to starve the British out by forcing the newly formed coalition of European states France now presided over to cut trading ties with Britain.
It's basically a reverse blockade is what he's trying to do.
was to put a stranglehold on Britain's economy, forcing the country's administration to sue for peace out of economic despair. However, that plan was foiled as well, but not by the Royal Navy. This time, it was Russia.
Darns our
So there you
Alexander.
go. From Napoleon's perspective, if Russia blatantly continued to trade with Britain, it made the entire embargo useless. In true early 19th century fashion, Napoleon knew the only way for Russia to answer for this was, well, war. Now, this wasn't the only reason, nor was it on a whim. France and Russia were very much competitors, each empire vying for control of their side of the European world.
Which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because who are the two nations that in the end up causing the downfall of Napoleon's French Empire? It's the British and the Russians, who are going to be France's biggest allies 100 years later in the Great War. The British and the Russians. Fascinating.
If Napoleon simply doesn't go to war with Russia, he would be allowing one rival to prop up another. But let's say Napoleon has the hindsight of a 21st century historian and decides that with Russia, it's simply not worth it. His army stays in France, and the status quo remains past 1812.
Whole world
What
changes. Now this, to me, is the diverging point, right? No Russian invasion. Now what happens? Now Napoleon doesn't lose 500,000 men invading Russia. He's got the manpower and the means to be able to hang on to power in mainland Europe.
It is an alternate 1812. Napoleon does not attack Russia, and instead decides he should pay far more attention to deal with the insurgency in Spain. That has always been a hellscape for France. Even without invading Russia, however, the nations he subdued would be plotting. No matter what Napoleon did, the continental system simply couldn't have held up. Sweden had illegally sent supplies to Britain, which France soon punished. Prussia understandably didn't want to fight French wars, and while France did secure a temporary alliance with Austria, this was an alliance with a strict end date in mind, even without a Russian war or a marriage. Because it's Napoleon, there was always going to be another war whether he wanted one or not.
That's probably true.
A result of rebellion from within his own alliance, by his fault or not, was always going to occur. But this time without France having its army decimated by Russia. A new war, whenever it may happen, certainly could have gone much differently for Napoleon. Even after losing almost 400,000 men on his march back to France, he was still able to win 5 battles.
That's true.
And then upon returning...
And even after all of that in Russia, he had an opportunity to hang on to his throne. He was offered peace that could have secured things, but he didn't take it.
400,000 new soldiers to fight on a new coalition of Sweden, Russia, Britain, and eventually Austria. While he did lose, it was still a tough fight, and not one you'd expect if most of Europe was against you. An alternate war is not a decisive victory for the Allies. Instead, this fight is once again drawn out. Perhaps Austria is less optimistic to betray Napoleon and join a war they know they might not win. Since this is speculation, it's not 100% France could win this war. All that
but I feel like a strong enough Napoleon, which there certainly would have been, minus the disaster of Russia, at some point, Austria, Russia, the British, all of them are going to say enough is enough. This is costing us too much in manpower and material and money. I mean, the British were just getting bled white in terms of finances by funding these wars, because they weren't just funding their own army and navy, they were funding everybody else's too. I feel like there would have been some negotiated settlement with Napoleon that would have lasted long term.
Is without Russia, France has a far better chance. At least with this war, Napoleon holds on to power well through the 1810s. So for the sake of the scenario, the war is over by 1815 or 16. Let's assume France wins. Napoleon secures his continental system, and perhaps Britain remains out of reach, but isn't a threat. Well, what now? This is where my video becomes a little bit of a lie. Sometimes in life you simply can't change nature. Napoleon may not have ever fell in this alternate timeline, but that doesn't mean he isn't brought down by the biggest battle of all, cancer. Napoleon died in 1821 from what we now believe to be stomach cancer.
Yeah, but there's a lot of other factors here that I feel like need to be considered. If it was indeed cancer, and I'm not entirely sure it was, I think there might have been some poison involved. Treatment might be different. Health might be different. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this.
He didn't simply die from a broken heart or anything. It was an actual health problem that would have taken his life no matter what. Napoleon, had he never fallen, would have died leaving his title as emperor, as all monarchs do, up to their sons. By 1821, assuming Napoleon still dies around the same time, his son Napoleon II would be crowned the Emperor of France, a boy at the age of 11, left to defend an already fragile system that, if it hasn't collapsed by now, would be crumbling. And it's not a shock France's rivals would call arms again. Europe divides itself much like the Congress of Vienna, so there, in the grand scheme, this could have been the situation. The problem that sometimes is faced with predicting events that never happened is we don't actually know how Napoleon might have changed with 10 extra years on the throne.
True.
Even in Waterloo, it's believed many of his failings may have just simply been because he wasn't the same bold leader he once was. With age came more caution. And moving forward into the next decade of his life, I wonder how much his failing health would have contributed to a weakened reign. Either way, in the grand long term, this Napoleonic France was always on a timer. No amount of military strategy or plan.
It's certainly possible, and I don't disagree with him strongly enough to say there's no way that's the case. That's absolutely a plausible scenario that, like many other empires before Napoleon's, it doesn't last real long after the man who built it is gone. Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, others, even Charlemagne.
Wins against the Grim Reaper. This is Cody of Alternate History.
All right, that was interesting. Let me know your thoughts. What do you think about all that? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? How do you see this whole thing playing out? I think these are fun exercises to have because they allow us to think outside the box and play through scenarios and talk about how important certain events were in terms of how they affected history. So hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you again real soon with another video. Thanks for watching.